Hello. On today's Society Blends episode 19, I have a subject that I hope is going to be very interesting for you. At least it's certainly for me. Well, we are going to discuss manga and how manga attracted and inspired foreigners and how it became the major cultural preference for many of them. Of course, this is an European perspective, so some of these aspects and some of these concerns may not be entirely accurate for the American market. However, I think it's important to see what this is all about. A distance presence. Why I mentioned this consideration? First of all, because we cannot consider cultural phenomenons in a void. Just about at any moment when a major cultural or technological breakthrough happens, we see similar examples popping up in many parts of our world. And comics and manga of course is one of them, certainly fits this description very well, because both what we consider the relatively modern comic strip style has been present both in the Japanese and the European market. Of course, there are some differences, and manga seems to go further back than the comic strip style that was developed in the Western world. So there are some uh, specifics about it. However, what matters a lot is that due to the way our society worked in the 19th century and the 20th century, there was very little exchange between creators on both on these sides of the world. However, this didn't mean that there was no influence and there was no inspiration. However, these trends happened a lot earlier, and the 20th century is actually very important for this aspect. What matters a lot, however, is that we shouldn't consider a visual style as being entirely rigid. And this is what matters a lot. Actually, it's very flexible. And as experimentation and innovation happened, it led to an evolution that went over centuries. And of course, it had its own special features that were more or less present and that later became a staple. Of course, what is also important is that success or failure do not depend actually on a particular solution that worked perfectly from the start. Far from that. And it shouldn't be judged more as an experimentation that was probably suitable for a specific era or a specific time period. And every time we experiment, we are actually making, or we are part of a process that involves and improves our minds, whether we are part of the public or part of the creators. So it's never bad to have this experience, and visual styles or visual art is actually one of the cultural products that benefits a lot from experimentation. This is why we shouldn't consider the former less elegant graphics way of expression as being less valuable than what we have today. We couldn't get to the level we have nowadays without being exposed to these previous creations. Transforming perceptions is essential because we have to understand the fact that manga is a cultural product that wasn't familiar to the Western audience. And this meant that um, there were actually some issues in having a connection and having the ease of understanding a lot of the details that pertain to particular customs or other such details that help a person be immersed in the world and the story that is being created and showcased through manga. However, despite being a cultural product that has national specifics, it shows an influence and an inspiration from foreign countries. And actually, this is one of the major alluring facts of manga, because manga doesn't feel entirely as a Japanese product, and it doesn't feel entirely as a Western product. So it creates a lot of interest for both the Eastern and the Western public. And this matters a lot because the way of expressing a background and characters that are having this sort of interesting mix between the two worlds is one of the elements that draws so much popularity. Of course, it's not necessarily the most straightforward one, because if we have to consider it as such, manga creations, and particularly the ones that reach the Western world, have been present much later than they were in the Eastern world. And this meant that in Japan they evolved to such a refinement that it meant only the best creations could probably reach the Western world. And being at the upper end of what popular culture could produce meant that manga was already perceived as a satisfying and insightful experience. And this meant a lot because it was entirely different from what an American or an European person might experience. And the fact that they could appreciate so much this format is due to the fact that it evolved up until this stage and was extremely successful in the way in which it was refined. Another very important aspect, and of course deriving from this state of refinement, is the strong aesthetic focus. And this is essential because it's a staple of manga. No matter how you consider it, it's the visually appealing style that really attracts the public, and is the first element with which you interact, the first element that is brought into your imagination and that creates lasting memory. And this matters a lot because it not only ensures a visually appealing end product, whether we are talking about manga or anime. And it is also because as evolution was experienced, quite elaborate or exquisite dressing styles and the specific fashion was brought to its audience. And this fashion, of course, is a mix between Japanese elements and Western, European, or American cues. And this matters a lot because it creates an identity. And this sense of identity is present not only in the message itself, but also in the symbolism it holds. And this means that it creates an all-compelling experience for the public that cannot be easily found anywhere else. And this is one of the major reasons that manga really transformed the perceptions of the public to which it was presented. And this meant that it created a very powerful, a very vocal fan base that ensured a transition that happened at a such fast pace later on. And this is one of the reasons why we may be surprised at the sudden popularity of this um, cultural manifestation, despite being so far from Japan and the part of the world in which it was originally designed and for which it was originally created. However, it's appealing, and it's appealing for a much larger part of the population, not only the one that resides in America and Europe. And this is one of the major reasons why we are um, very much in admiration over what actually happened. So it's obvious to question ourselves, why manga became attractive to foreigners, although I gave you part reasons, partly some reasons for that earlier on. The most important aspect I think that matters is the fact that both the European and the American public was already experienced in the comic style that was particular to their country. And this meant that similar creations could be judged for their aesthetic or for their intrinsic value. And if you take into account the fact that the Japanese manga has experienced refinement, and this meant a lot of time allotted for its evolution, it meant that when it reached the European or American market, it was already a major product, and one that was surprising actually to the audience in these geographical areas. First of all, because it has a different artistic style, a different artistic preference. It has tropes, a visual identity, and ideas that were so different from the European or American counterparts, while they were still somewhat similar in a way, at least at first sight, or in some of the scenes they were creating and some of the aspects that were presented in them. And this meant that it created a lot of curiosity for the public in trying to um, attempt a decode or an understanding of what the message could be. And this actually was part of the reason why the success was ensured, other than the visual style that was, of course, so much enticing to the audience. We have to think about the large facial features, the large and expressive eyes, and other elements that make it highly pleasant to see. However, there are also other elements that played in favor of manga. And one of the most important ones is the fact that both European and American comics were created for specific purposes. They were created for political satire. They were created for children in order to present them a different attitude that they should be following. However, they were essential. They were highly present in storytelling for the Asian public. And this meant that their omnipresence actually meant that they were already much more suited for both a younger and an older audience. And this was a surprise to Europeans and Americans, because the previous concept was that, of course, cartoons and comics were for children. And the way in which the American market concentrated on film or film cartoon hybrids for adults, and at most family cartoons, for instance, I don't know, you can think about The Simpsons, you can think about Family Guy and others, but these were family cartoons. And of course, Europe didn't create a lasting presence on cartoons that were catering towards a more mature audience. And this was a total difference from the Japanese manga and anime, because they were created for a wide ranging public, from children to adults, and they had so many themes and so many ideas that were highly suited to just about any age. And this meant that there was already a product that satisfied at least the curiosity of the European and American audience. And this is one of the reasons why it permeated in a way that was that had such an impact, even though initially, of course, the impact was relegated to persons that were not necessarily as comfortable or as appreciative of all the European or American cultural style that was promoted through standard um, creations. However, what matters is that we also have to see the process in both ways. Uh, Manga became attractive to the foreign public not only because it was successful in Japan and because it used um, a way that ensured success also for the future, because it had some very good ideas that were being used. No, it's not only that. It's also the fact that there was an exchange between European and American stylistic developments and their own Japanese ones, which meant that Japan also was opening more and more to foreign ideas and concepts, which means that um, by adapting their own way of creating the comic style or the visual style of anime and manga, they were also creating a product that was more attractive to the Western audience and one that was keeping its relevance for their own national market, which meant that they were able to secure this very important requirement of being still able to service the hopes and the expectations that the public had. Further on, there are also other interesting aspects that we have to consider. One of the most important ones is that, of course, the social stance on cartoons and comics was very different in the Western and the Eastern world. You can clearly notice in the image that I reproduced in this presentation that you can readily observe the fact that eyes, for instance, are quite small and not as expressive as they are on the manga style. You have the French style, which was obviously very successful on its own market, and of course in other European countries. It was the European style that was used for many decades in many countries in Europe with similar visual elements and with a similar outlook, a similar design, if you like. And you have the manga or Japanese comic strip style that was entirely different. It was, in some ways, a novel experience that mm, the Western public could not have. And this is part of the reasons why anime later had also a much broader influence and a much broader audience, because it came and filled a niche that was not served by cultural creations in America or Europe. There was also something to be said about the way in which fantasy was used, or fantastical elements were portrayed in American or European creations and in Japanese one. And the way in which there was even less of a restraint, of a constraint in the Japanese creations, meant that in some ways they were going even further in artistic experimentation. And this was also part of the reason why the public appreciated the manga creations and the anime ones that were later shown to the public in a similar form as a movie or a film would be. However, we don't have to take into account separately each and every element, but together they made a compelling case, at least for some individuals, to become fans of this artistic style. And this matters a lot because mm, Japanese content creators, artists, and of course, um, the whole team that is being involved in the creation of a particular cultural product was frequently much more consistent in its efforts to deliver a story that spans over a longer period of time. And this was somewhat less occurring in America or Europe. And this meant that as the public noticed there was so much involvement from creators, it meant that it also piqued their interest in trying to see how the story unfolds in sequels. And these are some of the reasons why the public was in awe to Japanese creations, although of course the number of people that were actually following the Japanese style was kept quite small. And this was also due to the fact that there were some elements that were not necessarily accessible to the Western public. The first one being the language, and the second one being various elements that to which they were not as interested in as they were for the ones that were obviously frequently present in their culture and in their nation. However, there was this allure of a different approach. Now, we really think about the rise in popularity outside Japan and how this actually happened. In some ways, it's quite obvious because technology and distribution networks simply allowed cultural products to travel so easily from one side of the world to another. And this meant that just about any movie, any book could easily reach the public on the other side of the world. So from east to west, it was relatively a long distance, but of course there were shipping routes. Of course, there were merchants that were interested in bringing these elements that were gaining popularity. And such products, of course, made their way into the east and some made their way into the west. And of course, it created commonality that later improved and induced an additional interest in seeing and finding more about the culture that was so far away. So, of course, this was one of the important aspects, but it was not the only one. We have to think about an information avid and a sophisticated public. Before the Second World War, fewer people had access to education. As more and more got used to education and to higher education, they developed refined tastes and they tried to find products that were catering to their needs. And this was part of the reason why they stepped outside the market that was familiar to most individuals and that was sufficient for many decades. Also, there is something to say about resources, or actually wages, travel, and leisure time. As working conditions improved, many persons uh, had the ability to have more time that could be devised as they would like. And of course, due to the evolution in commerce, there was also the ability to have more flights and more commercial routes that were serviced also by ships, trains, and so many other vehicles that you could have a much larger exposure to a different culture that was probably further and further away from your native country. And also, we have to consider globalization that slowly took place. And as more and more production facilities were outsourced from Europe and from America to Asia, it also meant that more persons that had the necessary means could travel to America and Europe in order to have a better life. And some of them, of course, came with their own cultural elements, or they promoted the same ideas they had at home. Of course, we may not be thinking at these elements as having a massive impact, but just about any of them in sufficient quantity is going to increase the interest in um, distant culture. And there is also the fact that television permeated more and more the public, and since so many television channels appeared on the world, there was a demand for content. And of course, there wasn't enough content being created in each country alone, so there was also an interest in expanding and having more content to choose from. And this is part of the reason why content was brought from Japan to America and Europe, and of course because it was cheaper back then than to have a whole production in these geographical areas. So there was also an economy aspect that was in play. And of course, some American and European creations that were affordable could be brought to the Japanese public. But I think this one was slightly less popular than the other process that happened back then. However, if we consider this fact that more and more books, more and more anime reached the European and American market, it also meant that there was a requirement for translation. And when translation was made available, it actually increased the exposure to manga and, of course, resulting in an additional interest in the Japanese culture. So it was a self-sustaining process, mostly because the products that were arriving on this market were surprising and they were having good artistic qualities. And of course, they were bringing something that was not available on the local market. And as the local market didn't cater to such fringe interests back then, it meant that more and more um, movies, anime, and manga reached these areas. And also because they reached the American and European continent much later than the Japanese one, it meant there was a delay. And due to the fact that from 1950s, from the Second World War, the world opened in surprising ways, at least to persons that lived before, it meant that the impact of the Japanese culture was not felt immediately in these areas. And this delay, of course, was amplified due to the social and political barriers that were present anywhere else in the world. So, for instance, Europe was divided between an east and the west side, and the control that was exerted on the central and eastern part of the Europe meant that the permeation of the Japanese culture was much more limited. It was not considered necessarily a threat, but it was frowned upon just like any other influence from the Western world. And of course, as such countries were free to choose their future later on, they also entered the same process of getting accustomed to cultural products of Japan. And as they got to experience them, they were mesmerized by them. And at least some of the individuals that were in this position grew to become very strong fans and advocates for it, which meant that there was a rise in popularity that mostly mimicked, or perhaps was even more amplified than was in the other parts of the European continent before. Of course, the same evolution happens today, and other parts, such as South America or Africa, are slowly being permeated by the Japanese culture as well. And of course, they developed tastes that are much more in line with what occurred in America and Europe. And this is what matters, because the rising popularity outside Japan is far from over. And although it's delayed by some decades due to what I mentioned before, the social and political barriers that are in place in different countries, they are still going to have an influence, and they will improve the way in which these individuals see themselves and see the society in which they are part of. However, despite what I said before, manga is not necessarily an easy product to consume. And you have to understand that and appreciate the fact that it requires ambition, it requires consistency in order to be able to achieve a good enough result and enjoy such cultural products. And we have to think about that. The first and perhaps the most obvious one is the language barrier. Sometimes you have products that have not been translated in English or in the native language of a particular country. And this means that it's difficult to understand the full meaning of what this artistic mode of expression offers. Another very important aspect is that the reading order is not the same. And if you want to create the same experience as you have in the original Eastern creations, it means that you have to have a different way in which you follow the comic strips blocks. And of course, this is a major difficulty for a person that is already accustomed to the typical left to right direction that we use most of the time as Westerners. You have to take into account that the way in which this reading order was created in ancient Japan was still present even in modern times. And there are moments when this older traditional style is still being used. And this means that you have to go on each row vertically, and when you end the row that is the rightmost, you go to the one that is on your left side. Of course, if you have a more intricate pattern, you have to go right to left and follow the guidelines as you can see in the second picture. Of course, these are only the most obvious elements that you may encounter. However, there is an essential vocabulary that has to be known, and the context and immersion that would be expected for a manga creation is quite difficult to achieve without getting familiar with honorifics, customs, dishes, and other popular places. Of course, there are situations where translations already change specific parts of the vocabulary in order to fit better the audience to which they cater. However, I don't think this is the best approach, as it leaves something to be desired in the way in which you are exposed to a new experience. So if you are going to replace, I don't know, for instance, the honorific san or chan, depending on age, with Mr., I think you are going to make a horrible choice that is not going to be helpful for you in understanding what the Japanese culture is all about and how it is different from ours. So there are many situations where it's better to leave as much as possible the original content and only adapt the words that are too difficult to convey in the culture and language you are familiar with in a particular part of the world. We have to consider that all of these novel aspects, whether they are due to the reading order, the vocabulary, or anything pertaining to a particular attitude or social custom, have to be understood by someone. And generally, there are very few books or other materials that help you adapt. So most of the time, especially as a young person, you are offered precisely a format and you have to understand it as you see it. So it's an experience that brings a lot of educational requirements, and this knowledge that is going to be accumulated actually helps a lot the individual in being more flexible in the future and developing new abilities. So it's not only the fact that it requires a specific set of skills that is different from the one you are already accustomed with, but it also offers a new perspective, because each and every time you learn something new and you learn and remember something consistently, you are having a new perspective, you are developing your abilities, you are improving your social performance. And I haven't said that in a light way, because you are part of a group that really focuses on a different part of the cultural range. And this matters a lot because it gives a sense of belonging and it gives an interest to pursue. And it not only stops there, because you have to think that for creative individuals, it offers the potential to experiment. And this means that you can create very easily something that is particularly catering to that culture. You can create and think about what you would like to do and think about the means you have at your disposal. You have learned a new approach to seeing the world that you may already be too familiar with. And this matters a lot because it also develops the appreciation for a different culture. You may understand that there is more commonality between you and a person that lives in the other part of the world than what you may consider. And this is actually very helpful for interactions and for developing a sense that helps a lot in interactions. So you may wonder why we are back to why manga became attractive to foreigners. Because there are some other elements that I may be advised to tell you about or to put more emphasis on. The first and the most obvious one is the attractive, colorful, energetic style that you see in so many manga or anime creations, particularly if they are in full color. And this entices and attracts the audience a lot. Even before, or much before they understand the vocabulary, they have something to look and be mesmerized about. And this matters a lot because it's the visual aspect that attracts us the first, and then we find out more that complement what we are seeing and further develop our interests due to exposure. Another very important aspect is accessibility. This may not be obvious as first, because sometimes we may think that accessibility only pertaining to the availability of a translation, but it goes actually much further from that. We see manga going from printed materials, from books and magazines, to television in digital media, of course, in some ways using the anime format or the movie format that is adapted to manga creations. However, we notice that it goes much more seamlessly from one type of media to another. And this has a strong influence because the same style you see in printed form, you can experience in the others. And the more you are moving, the more you are experiencing an even better visual style and an even better way to convey emotions and meanings. And this type of creation actually lends very well to the graphic style and the development that is present in our world. And of course, the success of anime and manga goes very well hand in hand. And it's one of the major reasons why this genre gains so much support and fans, because they can see a story evolving from one form to another, and it still retains the meaning, significance, and mm, entertainment, emotion you can derive when it goes through these stages. And of course, due to the fact that we have streaming solutions, we have extensive distribution networks, shipping networks, for instance, has created a new golden era for anime and manga, because more persons can be easily exposed to products that are much more easier to distribute. And since there is already someone that is attracted to this format in your country, it means that it is already more attractive for someone else to supply it to you. And this means that we haven't been seeing the full extent to which manga can permeate our societies. And of course, we have to give a special mention for pop culture tropes. We have to think about the beautiful or the surprising, the enticing entertainment that comes together with being part of this manga fan club. And this includes events, venues, and products that include, in some ways or another, the manga theme. This means, of course, cosplay, which is highly popular, and of course, it's a very nice fashion element. It lends to products that use manga elements, such as, I don't know, consumer products like um, beauty products, like everyday products. I don't know, even pencil boxes may have such themes, school bags, and just about anything, including our mundane notebooks, can be personalized with manga creations. And this creates a whole world that revolves around manga, and it brings a lot of satisfaction to someone that is part of this trend. So you may wonder why we have to consider it an open-ended story and not a happy ending one. If we are true to ourselves, we can clearly consider that it's a happy end story. However, it's one that has not reached the full potential. And this is why I'm considering it an open-ended story of our time. Because manga will certainly go and follow us into the future with newer and newer generations being exposed to the wonder that we have, mostly since the early 80s, but probably clearly since the 2000s in Europe and America, as everything went in full swing. Because as every generation passed on the experience and the joy of being exposed to manga, it increased self-sustainability, it gave purpose to a newer generation and joy, and of course increased the popularity of the genre, because you are not only consuming, you are actually part of the production network most of the time. Even if not directly, you may be just promoting your ideas, but still you're exposing more and more people to this genre and to its attraction. And this matters a lot. Next is that manga and anime remained relevant whether you're considering younger individuals or older ones, because the same highly appealing visual style is being used. And whether the stories are in monochrome or full color, they still are very strong. And since there is a very large variety of themes, tropes that can satisfy your curiosity, it means that just about any um, aspect you would like to imagine, any kind of theme would be present, and you would find at least a book or an anime that focuses on what you were thinking. Perhaps not in the way you would like, but certainly as an experience that is already available. There is also another aspect that we probably do not see or do not consider it as much, or perhaps for some of you it may be entirely obvious. We are living in a world that has a population that slowly ages. However, this process is advancing, and of course, as lifespans increase and as we live better but also more competitive lives, we frequently see less the desire to have a larger family, and an increasing population, of course, has its own issues in terms of support, in terms of the pressure it puts around the world, which means obviously that more persons are going to be of an advanced stage today due to advances in medical systems and, of course, better living conditions, which obviously means that the younger population will have to relate to older ones much easily. And this experience is actually important also for themselves, because they will later on probably be experiencing a process that is even more severe than today, which means that they would have to maintain their youth manifestations. And of course, this means that older persons may also have to have a common way of relating to the younger one. And this means that ways of behavior that were previously being frowned upon for adults, for instance, a playful attitude, may be much more acceptable today than they were in the past. And of course, this is the normal course of action. However, what matters is that this brings us closer together, and of course, this is a good example for our society. And I mentioned neoteny because this means that people are experiencing a lengthened adolescence. And this lengthened adolescence is not going to be abruptly finished when a person enters adulthood. And it's actually a very important element because these crushings of hopes, dreams, and ways of manifestation just because other society members are not willing to see you act in such a way are gradually um, being raised, and they are out of discussion. And this is going to be very helpful because manga actually doesn't create an attitude that is against aging and against the way of still being in some ways playful. And this matters a lot because, as mentioned before, we are living in a world that transforms, and the more we are accepting of this transformation and the more we are getting together peacefully and with even more uh, results, it's going to be something that is going to be deeply helpful for our society. And of course, the last and the most important element. There is a lot of enthusiasm and freedom of expression that is being felt by individuals that are part of this very large fan club that holds the anime and manga culture close. Whether you may consider this as a slight exaggeration, I think it's far from that, because there are so many elements that are a living proof that younger and both older individuals are so enthused, so happy, so joyous about being part of this world and being able to express as the culture has shown it to be possible, that when this is put into practice, it leads to extremely good long-term projects, or mm, it allows the individuals to express themselves in a way that enhances their well-being or improves their well-being, and also by having various products that reflecting the same ideas and the same world around them make them feel more comfortable. And this sense of comfort and the freedom to act in a way that you already like so much is helping a lot the appeal of manga and anime. So without further ado, I hope you enjoyed the video. There are actually much more aspects I would like to present, but I think they are better left for another video. And I will give you just a small detail I would like to share to you, the fact that in the future, augmented reality may bring another major chapter in the evolution of manga. And this is going to be, of course, something that we'll experience probably in the next few years. So it's very far from being a story that ends with a simple book in front of us and with a couple of movies that we may consider all too obvious by now. Let's enjoy manga and anime. And just as well, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching.